David Allen Miller in Cosmos. Checking on someone about music and other stuff.
Given all the free time we have, I thought it would be really fun to reach out to some of my close friends with whom I'm not in contact because they may be 2,000 or 3,000 miles away, and to just hear how they're doing and make sure they're okay. So I thought I'd start today with one of my oldest and dearest friends from the music world, the great American composer Michael Torke. Michael is one of my dearest friends, and we really sort of came up together. We were born, I think, less than a year apart, and I did his his second orchestral piece, and subsequent to that have done, 30, 40, 50 pieces of his and hundreds of performances. We've recorded a lot of his music, and he's just a great, great guy. So I'm delighted to welcome him. Hello, Michael. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing fine. Thank you, David.
Great to have you with me, and great to hear you and to see you. So you're not in New York City where you often live, right? Where are you at the moment?
In my house in Las Vegas, right on the edge of the desert.
Right, and I guess we should probably tell everybody that you have this wonderful situation where you have a wonderful, slightly smaller residence in New York City, and then a rather bigger one, from what I gather, although I've never seen it, in Las Vegas. Is that fairly accurate, or?
Yeah, two-story, three-bedroom house here.
Wow.
In New York, I have an apartment near the UN. I think you did come over once.
Oh, I came over there. Sure, that's a great. I love your door. Your door is so beautiful. It's like that big metal. What is that? Is it like zinc or something? It's fantastic.
Oh, it's just brushed metal, David.
It's fantastic. I love it. You got that great view of the UN and the East River and all that. That's fantastic. So, do you use your two homes for different kinds of things? I mean, do you find you're more creative when you're out in the desert, or does it not matter?
Yeah, when I moved here, which is now 13 years ago, I thought that only good work could be done in New York, where it's stimulating, and I would relax out here. But I soon realized it doesn't matter where I am. If I'm here, I do as good a work as I can. I can focus really well. And then when I'm in New York, if I can tune out all the stimulation, I can work very well there too. So it doesn't matter.
It doesn't get kind of lonely out there in your big 2-story, 3-bedroom house in the desert?
Well, David, we walk through this life alone, no matter how many people surround us. So loneliness is an issue wherever I am, and it's a non-issue wherever I am.
But I know you have a great circle of friends and certainly colleagues in New York City, because you've lived so much of your life there, even though you are.
Developed a group of friends here as well.
Oh, that's great. Even though I know you're a native of the great community of Wauwatosa. Is that right?
It's the suburb of Milwaukee.
Yes. And I know that you were once called the Toast of Tosa, because when I conducted the Milwaukee Symphony, I mentioned you, and they were like, Michael Torke, the Toast of Tosa?
You're the only one who's ever told me that.
Well, I thought it was so funny.
I've never heard that in my life.
You're not known as being anything to do with Milwaukee, but in Wauwatosa, you're really big news. I think. Yeah. So how's it going out there? Have they shut everything down, like in our poor beloved city of New York?
It's much like New York, where it's not shelter at home like California, but in New York, you're supposed to stay at home, and only the essential businesses are open, and a casino is considered non-essential.
Oh, I'm relieved to hear that. I would assume
one industry town, so it's really the town is shut up.
But I would have assumed in Las Vegas that would be considered the essential industry. But I'm glad to hear the Nevadans have enough sense to shut their casinos. I see. Well, that must be pretty eerie, right?
Yeah, I thought I haven't done a lot of driving around. There is less traffic, but there are a lot. It's a city of 2.1 million, I think. Right, and there are certainly a lot of other businesses that are going on.
Right. So a lot of us have this idea that Las Vegas is the Strip, but I assume you residents don't even spend time on the Strip very much, right?
I'm 25, 30 minutes away from the Strip, right on the edge of the desert where it becomes wilderness.
And do you go to the supermarket, or how do you get your food during this crisis?
Well, same as everyone else. I can drive to Albertsons or Walmart, and they'll let 20 people in at a time.
Oh, they do. So there are lines there too. I see.
Yeah. And it's sort of, I think, very similar to California and New York, but different.
But it's not it's not gone wild there the way it has in New York City. I mean, New York City is now just terrifying to go anywhere.
Right. And then the numbers are much less. The number of cases, the number of deaths is way, way down. So it certainly feels safer.
Oh, well, that's good. And you've been there since before the big outbreak, or?
I flew out here. So I was in New York for 6 weeks before then.
Uh-huh.
And certainly I could have been a carrier of the virus without knowing it. But 14 days later, my health is exactly the same. In fact, we're going on 3 weeks since I've gotten back, and everything is fine.
Well, that's great. And I guess it pays to be a solitary person, right? Do you?
But I mean, I was at risk. I took subways everywhere. I was
you
out
did?
every night going to
Wow.
concerts, and the
Yeah.
theater. So if anyone would have caught it, it would have been me.
Yeah. So, are you working? Are you able to work? Is it a? Huh?
I mean, I was thinking about this before we connected today, how there's kind of two types of creativity in our world. One is highly dependent on other people. For instance, if you are a conductor or a director of theater, you need other people to do your work. If you're a performing musician, an actor, yes, you can do a monologue, but you really become an actor when you do scenes. You become a musician when you play chamber music or you play in orchestras. All of these people who are creative have big challenges. But then the other side of creativity is the writer's side. If you're a poet, if you're a novelist, if you're a composer, you spend most of your creative energy in isolation. That is the default mode. And so it's a kind of an ironic thing that in this time when we're given brownie points to stay at home, that I have no social responsibilities of seeing anyone or going out. I can get even more work done.
You're like perfect at it. It's great. But I guess the corollary question is, until orchestras and ensembles come back, is there a limit to what you're being asked to write or commissions or things like that? I mean, I assume that everything's kind of, for your life, a little bit on hold as well, even though...
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, but my career has sort of gradually morphed into something different from what it was. So if this were 30 years ago or 25 years ago, I'd be all concerned that my commissions all lined up. Oh, they're not going to happen. Why should I write this piece? Blah, blah, blah. But now I'm doing kind of self-imposed work, a lot of it that I'm financing the recordings with my own record company, et cetera, et cetera. And so my feeling is I hope we find a vaccine so we can all get back to work. But until that time, I can just keep dreaming up projects and schedule it into the future.
Right. And also, I actually think that, anytime you want to write a piece that's not for live instruments, it would still be a great piece. I mean, even when I don't know if people know, but, when you write a piece for the Albany Symphony, for example, you very graciously at some point send me a MIDI realization, which is just an electronic realization that obviously doesn't sound nearly as beautiful or as rich or as full as the orchestra, but they sound pretty great for your music. I mean, your music really lends itself to that kind of realization.
But those things are actually worthless.
No, I know they are. But I'm just thinking, like, if you wanted to write
our work, but I don't consider that creating any kind of the realization that I need.
But if
we still are so highly dependent on the live players,
you wouldn't write purely electronic music.
No,
you wouldn't.
I'm not interested.
Oh, that's so interesting.
The project right before this one is using an electronic form called progressive house, which is purely music written for computers. And my conceit was you assign all of those difficult rhythms to live human beings, live musicians. And even though they're very difficult, we can edit so that human beings can play in a superhuman way. And I think that will be rich.
Well, on behalf of all the living musicians, live musicians, and conductors and performers, I thank you because there are certainly some composers, one of whom I know very well because he's my child, who are not dependent on live performers to perform their works, and that's kind of lucky at a time like this, right? What's that? Sorry.
I think that's exciting that all that music exists, and it certainly was a model for me. Why would I be listening to it if I didn't like it?
Right.
I just want to realize my intentions in a different way.
But we love that you write for live instruments, and I should mention, as a lot of the Albany Symphony public knows for sure, and people who follow you or follow what I do with the Albany Symphony, that we've had this wonderful string of pieces, particularly the recent string of them, and 2 recent recordings, the most recent of which we actually got that Grammy nomination for the piece you wrote for Tessa Lark, Sky, for bluegrass, violin, and orchestra, and then those beautiful 3 woodwind mini concertos that you wrote for us that were so great. And I really wanted to ask you just a little bit about Sky. I know you've talked about it at various points, but can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of that? Because I gather it was really a departure for you in that you, were sort of assimilating an idiom that you hadn't known that much about.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way. As we get older, we become creatures of habit. And my feeling is that I always want to be young in my creativity, young at heart. And one thing that younger people do is they're always making discoveries. And so not to fall back into the same patterns, I wanted to find a style of music that I knew very little about. And as long as I can be tutored in it, well, I found the perfect person, Tessa Lark, who I wrote a violin and piano piece for. And the program note stated that I was influenced by her Kentucky heritage, which is sort of like, oh, you write anything for a program note to make it sound interesting. That wasn't really true. I used a détaché bow stroke, which is found just as much in bluegrass as it is in Baroque music, and that was my nod to her Kentucky statehood. So at our recording, I said, well, Tessa, what if I really was influenced by bluegrass? With your guidance, would you play it? And she said, of course, I'd love to. And Silas Brown, our trusted producer, said, and I'll record it. And that to me was confirmation it might be a project worth doing. And the next person I called was you, David. And I said, well, could we fit it into your schedule? And you said yes, very graciously.
Well, I was very excited to do it, yeah. But I thought it was quite magnificent how you sort of digested a lot of elements from the style, but without seeming like you were writing faux bluegrass, or the second movement is this beautiful set of Irish dances. And it doesn't sound like you're aping Irish music. It just has this wonderful little bit of inflection. I was just wondering how you as a creative artist do that, because I'm sure you're very concerned about appropriation that seems inauthentic or not true. And how do you do that and manage to keep your own voice?
I mean, I'm not quite sure what identity really is in the arts, but certainly we all value identity and profile and one's own voice. I think it has something to do with how the kind of craft, if that can be, the way that notes are put together, the kinds of inner relationships between materials on a micro and a macro level. And I've been generating ways of developing music over 35 years. So I thought if I would take that set of like compositional principles and impose that, it's almost like an input-output machine. It doesn't even matter. It's almost irrelevant or arbitrary what goes into the input machine. What comes out is the transformation on these various strategies I have of putting notes together. So I was pretty confident that, even if I didn't understand bluegrass, even if I didn't particularly like it, something would come out that would still retain that kind of profile or identity. I mean, that sounds a little bit hubristic, but that's kind of the faith that I go on, that it's going to work.
Well, I think in the case of that piece, it really did. So tell me about progressive house. What is it about progressive house that attracts you for this next project?
Well, I mean, here in Las Vegas, there's this whole EDM kind of DJ movement. It became, I think about 5 years ago, like the center of the world for like club music. Huh. And the funny thing is I've never set foot in any of those clubs, and I'm not sure why. Maybe they wouldn't let me in. Well, I don't have the looks. I don't have the age.
I think they have an age cutoff, so you probably wouldn't get in. I'm afraid about that.
No, but I am interested in what makes music have a groove. And house music has developed in a lot of different branches of trance and bass and drums, forms that I know very little about. But I stumbled on YouTube to one subset of the style called progressive house, which is slightly more poppy, kind of like 1970s harmonic materials, slightly more melodic. There's a big Japanese influence. And I started doing the same thing I did with bluegrass, and that is to take the music and slow it down to 5 times its speed and transcribe it literally by hand, writing down everything that I hear and studying it. And oh, that's how that groove works. And I think it comes from West African rhythms, and some of those rhythms found their way to Brazilian music. All of this is related, and I find it fascinating.
Cool. That's great. So I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is about, given that you've been writing for orchestras for 35 years or so, or more, I think more, how has your relationship to the orchestra or the idea of the orchestra changed? I mean, orchestras and the idea of orchestras is in such transition in all sorts of societal ways, but as a creative artist and as someone who writes music, quite wonderful music for orchestra, and has kind of for a long, long time, how has that changed as you've grown?
Well, I think it changes in 2 ways. One is that orchestration is not a science, it is kind of an art. And when I say orchestration, I mean, how do you combine the instruments to have effective, pleasing sounds? And you can study all the scores of all the great masters who've solved those orchestrational problems. And still, the best way to learn is through experience. So the older you get, the better orchestrator you become, because you've just been through all different kinds of problems that you've written for orchestras, and you've heard them in rehearsal, and you say, oh, that doesn't work, that does. So in that way, I think it's changed. I've become better at orchestrating. And then the other way it changes is that I get to know the musicians of the orchestra. I was very shy when I was younger, and maybe even a little bit arrogant, like, oh, I'm the composer, you play it. But now at rehearsals, I go back, I talk to the horn section, I talk to the wind players, I say, tell me what feels uncomfortable. And just talking, for instance, to a French horn section. I think the year was 2002. I was working in Canada and with the National Ballet of Canada there. And the hornist took me aside and said, here's how you write for horn. You have to deal with these range issues and these breath issues. I mean, basic horn writing 101. And I kept thinking, I've been writing for the horn section for 15 years. And yet I didn't know how to do it until I talked to that guy.
Well, it's good you got a Canadian horn player, because an American horn player would have been a lot less polite. But I'm sure the Canadian horn player was very gentle about the whole thing, right? But I guess my corollary question to that is, what's your advice to young composers, to young creators who want to write for orchestra? Is it just do a lot of it, or are there other? I mean, I actually think. Well, you answer, and then I'll give you my answer, partial answer.
I think that you have to keep your ears open, and you have to have kind of a respect for the institution. I mean, this idea of a young composer coming, I'm going to, rethink the whole orchestra. Okay, great. You're a genius. We thank you. But in a certain way, when you have the kind of history, you need to kind of understand what has been accomplished already. And there's a certain built-in respect for that. And so orchestral musicians can teach us a lot. And I wish I had more open ears when I was in my 20s. I could have learned faster. But the other advice is you have to go back and study the scores. And what I find is that young composers don't even study the scores. All the orchestrational, I would say 80 to 90% of the orchestrational problems are all solved by the masters before us. You have to hunt them out. Too often a young composer opens up a score and says, like, here's one of the hardest orchestrational problems. Give the entire orchestra a D major chord and make it sound great. That's the hardest thing to do. And so a young composer opens up and says, D major chord, yeah, great, I know how to do that. You do? I still don't know how to orchestrate a D major chord. I'm still struggling with that.
Right.
And every composer, Mozart does it so different from Ravel, so different from Brahms. And you have to understand, Rimsky-Korsakov does it different yet. You have to understand these things. So study is essential.
Yeah, I want to second from a conductorial perspective what you said about youth and an unwillingness or a shyness about asking questions or about showing what you don't know. Because I'll tell you, I had the exact same experience when I was about the same age. When I was 26, I think I was 26. I won the job as assistant conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and there I was surrounded by some of the most expert musicians in the world who had unbelievable knowledge. I mean, the concertmaster had played with Toscanini at the time and various other players like that. And I was so afraid of all the things I didn't know, and that I was supposed to be, when I was on the podium, conducting this great orchestra, even though I really had no business doing it, that I missed so many opportunities to ask people questions, just the kinds of questions you asked about, how do you make the cello section sound unified in this? How do you create, how do you approach bowing so that all the violins sound such and such? Or, how do you blend the trumpets with the oboes? There was so much I could have learned during that time, and I was so afraid to ask questions that I learned a fraction of what I should have. So I think that's a great answer for young people, that you have to not be afraid of what you don't know, because those are the people who really succeed, are the ones who aren't afraid to ask. And I remember I remember just one of the members of the Philharmonic, the librarian, was this amazing, at the time, very old gentleman named Jimmy Dolan, and he'd been Toscanini's personal librarian, and he would say things like, he was a great guy, and he would always confide in me or ask me things, and he would say, I used to deliver these scores to the Gershwins. You know where the Gershwins lived? They lived on Riverside Drive. And then he would tell me the address and say, and the mom was there. And then he'd say, I don't know, Ravel told me that he meant to finish this. And it was really crazy. Like, the guy had been everywhere and worked with everyone. So he was actually a great resource. But I felt, for years, ever since, I felt like there was so much knowledge that those great musicians had, and I feel that way about our musicians in the Albany Symphony and about musicians in every orchestra, that we conductors and composers can learn so much from them if only we're willing to ask.
I so agree. Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Sure. Well, thank you for saying that. So I figure we should probably wrap it up soon, but just tell me, about your view of the world now. It's kind of a strange, troubling time. I know you're a little bit out of the worst of it because you're not currently in New York City.
Yeah, and I thought about this before we started today, that I didn't want to make any forecasts. I didn't want to make any pronouncements. We all hope for the best.
That's too bad, because Dr. Fauci was hoping that you would tell him what the prognosis is.
Yeah, I mean, we live in times of crises. All the opportunists come out, and I can't stand that phenomenon. The other thing that happens in crises...
Who are the opportunists? Who are the opportunists? The ones who are selling $20 rolls of toilet paper?
Yeah, the ones that are hoarding and then up pricing. But what I mean is that everyone wants to give an answer to this crisis, because we also thirst for an answer. So everyone just starts speaking nonsense. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know exactly how it's going to affect the economy. We don't know if the vaccine is going to be successful. We don't know how it's going to mutate. So we can't make pronouncements, and I refuse to do that.
Well, that's good. That's certainly shut everybody down. But tell me, your dad and your sisters, everybody's okay?
Everyone is okay so far,
okay.
Yes.
They're mainly...
I wanted to just say one other thing. I don't know if you can use this, but there's an old saying that when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. In other words, in good times, everyone is doing well. But in times of crises, we come in contact with who we really are and what is the true nature of our being in terms of our generosity, our honesty, our willingness to help. And it's interesting to see how it affects different people.
So is there anything else that you want to say that is pertinent or important at this point? Or it doesn't have to... Like anything I missed or should have asked you, or any things you want to...
No, I mean, I just want to emphasize to your viewers that, you said it was my second orchestra. I think of you as the person I started working with, and here we are all the way close to the end, and I'm still working with.
Well, let's hope we're not close to the end. We're not that close to the end, are we? I hope we're not.
No, I mean, it's a span of 35, 36.
I've got at least a good 3 years left in me, buddy. Don't rush me. Don't rush me. Yeah.
Yeah, I said that wrong, David.
Here we are at our midpoint. The midpoint. We're at the midpoint.
Thanking you for your loyalty, David, and your support. That's what I'm
Michael, I got to say, back at you. I mean, all those years when your early meteoric rise, You were so sweet. You invited me to conduct the city ballet, your new ballet. You invited me to England and around the world, and you were so gracious and wonderful to me. And I love your music. I love being with you, and you've been a great friend of mine.
Many more years.
Yeah. So listen, I want you to know, even though we can't prognosticate about the future, that we're still very eager to have you write a whole bunch more pieces for us. We've had such a wonderful time with those. I think they're like 6 concerti you've written for us in the last 3 years or so. And they've all been, I think, in their own unique ways, quite spectacular. And well, I think that's probably enough concerti for the moment. We'd love another big orchestra piece and whatever you feel like you want to write. So I'm hoping when we're back to business within the next many months, I guess, that we can keep talking about future projects because we love to play your music.
Let's keep talking. And I always love writing for the orchestra. So,
All right. So, and you don't think you'll be back on this coast until like the fall, or until when do you?
oh, again, I have no way of saying. My flight back is April 27th, but
Oh.
all of my appointments in New York have all been canceled. So I don't know.
All right. Well, we hope you come back eventually, and I hope you stay safe and just be good to yourself. And it's great to talk to you.
Family the same.
Thanks. It's great to see you, man.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.